The strangest warning I ever received came on my wedding day. It was not given to me. It was whispered to my husband. The reception was still going on when my mother-in-law pulled Levi aside near the barn door. Hundreds of guests were eating, talking, and laughing behind them. Plates clattered on long wooden tables. Children ran between the benches. The smell of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and wood smoke filled the air. She placed one hand on Levi's arm, leaned close, and whispered something in Pennsylvania Dutch. At the time, I could not hear her. Years later, Levi finally told me what she had said. If she gets scared tonight, be patient. She will settle. That was all. No one told him what to do if I did not settle. No one told him what fear looked like when it became silence. No one told either of us that patience was not the same as permission. But I am getting ahead of myself. That morning, I was 19 years old, standing barefoot on the cold linoleum floor of my mother's kitchen while 3 women prepared me for marriage. My mother adjusted the hem of my blue dress. Aunt Rebecca fixed the pins in my covering. Aunt Miriam stood by the stove, watching me with an expression I could not understand. They moved around me the way women moved when preparing a large meal, quietly, efficiently, each one knowing her task. No one asked how I felt. That would have required me to know. My mother hummed a hymn as she worked. Her fingers were rough from years of gardening, washing, sewing, and raising 11 children. Every few moments she stepped back and looked at me with pride. "You look proper," she said. Proper. That word followed us everywhere. A proper dress, a proper wife, a proper marriage, a proper silence. I had known Levi since childhood. Our families lived only a few miles apart. We attended the same Sunday singings and community gatherings. When we were children, we stole sugar cookies from his mother's cooling rack and ate them behind the smokehouse. I knew the sound of his laugh. I knew he disliked turnips. I knew he always gave the last piece of pie to his youngest sister. But there were things I did not know. I did not know what happened between a husband and wife after the bedroom door closed. I did not know the language of bodies. I did not know that a woman could say no. No one had ever said that word in the same sentence as marriage. When my dress was finally pinned, my mother guided me toward a kitchen chair. "Sit," she said. The other women became strangely interested in their work. Aunt Rebecca folded cloths that were already folded. Aunt Miriam wiped a clean counter. My mother sat across from me and took both my hands. Her expression had changed. The pride was gone. In its place was something heavier. "He will be nervous," she said. I waited. "You must not make it harder for him." My fingers tightened beneath hers. "I don't understand." Her eyes moved toward the other women, then back to me. "Just be still," she said. "That is the important thing. Be still, and it will pass." That was my entire education about the wedding night. Be still. I wanted to ask what would pass. I wanted to ask what he would do. I wanted to ask why she looked frightened while telling me not to be afraid. But in our world, daughters did not question mothers about such things. So I nodded. My mother squeezed my hands, stood, and returned to my dress as though the conversation had never happened. One by one, the women left the kitchen, all except Aunt Miriam. She was the oldest of my mother's sisters. She had given birth to 9 children and buried 2 before they were old enough to speak. Her husband had died when she was 40, and she had never remarried. People called her strong. In our community, strong usually meant a woman had suffered without making other people uncomfortable. She sat in the chair my mother had left and stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "They do not tell us anything." I looked toward the doorway, afraid someone might hear. Aunt Miriam lowered her voice. "They push us into deep water and expect us to swim." I did not know what to say. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small glass jar. It contained a thick yellow salve, the same kind we used on cracked hands during winter. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "For afterward," she said. My face grew hot. "It may help with the soreness." Before I could ask another question, she stood and walked away. The jar felt heavy in my hand. It was the first honest thing anyone had given me that day. Not an explanation, not protection, just medicine for pain everyone already expected. I hid it beneath folded clothes in my trunk. Then the church bells began. The wedding ceremony lasted nearly 3 hours. 300 people sat on hard benches while the bishop spoke about duty, obedience, family, and fruitfulness. He described marriage as a field entrusted to a husband and wife. The husband would plow, the wife would receive the seed. I stared at my hands. Beside me, Levi sat stiffly in his black wedding coat. His hands were trembling. Until that moment, I had believed fear belonged only to me. Then I saw a bead of sweat slide down his temple. During one of the long prayers, everyone knelt on the wooden floor. Levi shifted beside me, and his elbow brushed mine. The touch was barely anything, cotton against wool, but it sent a jolt through me. This is real, I thought. Tonight, I will belong to him. I glanced at his face. His jaw was clenched, his eyes were closed, but I could tell he was not praying. His breathing was too shallow. I wanted to reach for his hand. I wanted to whisper, "Are you scared too?" But there were hundreds of witnesses around us, so I remained still. After the ceremony came the feast. Long tables filled the barn. There were casseroles, chickens, bread, pickled vegetables, cakes, and more pies than I could count. People congratulated me as if I had completed something difficult. Older women hugged me and said, "You will understand soon." Young girls stared at me with curiosity. Across the barn, Levi stood surrounded by his brothers and cousins. They slapped his back and laughed loudly. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. Plowing, planting, a strong harvest. Levi's face turned red. He forced a smile while the men laughed. For a moment, I felt angry for him. Then I realized they were talking about me. My body was the field in every joke. My fear was the entertainment. The feast ended late, but the work continued. Benches had to be stacked, dishes had to be washed, leftover food had to be packed away. Levi and I barely spoke. Every few minutes, I felt him watching me. When I turned, he looked away. I wanted to walk across the room and say something simple. Anything. We do not have to be afraid. We can talk first. We can wait. But I did not know waiting was possible. No one had ever described the wedding night as a choice. Near 11 o'clock, my mother-in-law appeared beside me. She did not use my name. "Time, daughter," she said. The room seemed to grow quiet, although people were still talking. My mother kept her eyes on the dishes. Aunt Miriam looked at me once, then looked away. I dried my hands on my apron. They were shaking. The bedroom was upstairs. I had helped prepare it myself. A new straw mattress, a white sheet, a wedding ring quilt I had stitched during the winter, a kerosene lamp, a wind-up clock. No mirror. The stairs creaked beneath my feet. Levi followed a few steps behind me. Neither of us spoke. At the top of the stairs, I stopped outside the bedroom door. From below came the muffled sound of laughter. Someone called Levi's name. More laughter followed. He reached past me and opened the door. The room smelled of fresh straw, lamp oil, and new fabric. I stepped inside. Levi entered behind me. Then he closed the door. The latch clicked into place. It was a small sound, but to me, it sounded like the whole world locking us in. The sound of the latch echoed through the room. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The laughter downstairs became distant, replaced by the steady ticking of the old wind-up clock on the dresser. Tick, tick, tick. I would remember that sound for years. It became the heartbeat of the longest night of my life. Levi stood with his back against the closed door, his hand still resting on the wooden latch, as if he had forgotten why he had closed it in the first place. He looked nothing like the confident groom everyone had teased downstairs. His face was pale. His hands shook. He opened his mouth twice before any words came out. I don't really know how this starts. For the first time that entire day, I almost smiled, because I didn't know either. We were two frightened 19-year-olds standing in a room that suddenly felt far too small for the expectations waiting inside it. The bedroom was simple. A fresh straw mattress rested against the wall beneath a small window overlooking the cornfield. The white quilt I had sewn myself lay perfectly smooth across the bed. Every stitch had been sewn while imagining happiness. Now those same stitches looked like questions I couldn't answer. The kerosene lamp threw long shadows across the walls. Everything seemed larger than it really was, even silence. Levi finally stepped away from the door. "I guess," he whispered, then stopped again. He rubbed the back of his neck, something he always did when he was nervous. "My brother tried to explain things." His voice cracked. "He wasn't very helpful." I looked down at my hands. "What did he say?" Levi laughed once. It wasn't really laughter. He said, "If you're gentle, everything works itself out." He looked embarrassed the moment the words left his mouth. I don't think he knew much either. That was the moment I realized something that would take me years to fully understand. Neither of us had been prepared. The women had taught me silence. The men had taught him confidence. Neither lesson was enough. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, leaving as much space between us as possible. "I've been scared all day," he admitted. His confession surprised me. Men were never supposed to admit fear. "I thought I was the only one," I whispered. He looked at me for the first time since entering the room. "No." His answer came immediately. "I've been terrified since this morning." Something inside me softened. For a few precious minutes, we simply talked. Not about marriage, not about expectations, about ordinary things. The weather, harvest season, his youngest sister accidentally dropping a pie during the reception, my little brother falling asleep halfway through the bishop's sermon. We laughed quietly together. Real laughter this time. For a moment, it almost felt like we were sitting on a porch after Sunday supper, instead of standing at the edge of a moment neither of us understood. But eventually, the silence returned. This silence was different, heavier, waiting. Levi looked toward the bed, then back at me. "I think," he swallowed hard, "I think we're supposed to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We both knew what he meant, not because anyone had explained it, because everyone expected it. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the cornfields. The clock continued its endless rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Levi reached for my hand. His fingers were ice cold. "So," he whispered, "if anything hurts—" He stopped again. "My brother said—" He looked embarrassed. "He said the first time is difficult." He searched for better words. None came. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I wish someone had explained it better." I nodded. "So do I." Neither of us knew that love required conversation. Neither of us knew that fear could be spoken instead of hidden. We only knew duty. Everything after that happened slowly, not violently, not angrily, just awkwardly, like two people trying to perform a dance they had never been taught. The room felt smaller with every passing minute. The lamp burned lower. The straw mattress crackled beneath the slightest movement. Every sound seemed impossibly loud. The clock, the wind, our breathing. Every few moments, Levi would stop and quietly ask, "Are you all right?" Each time I answered exactly the same way. Yes. It wasn't completely true, but I didn't know any other answer. No one had ever told me I could say, "I'm frightened," or "I need a moment," or simply, "No." Those words didn't exist inside the world I had been raised in. Instead, I remembered my mother's advice: "Be still. It will pass." So I became still. I focused on the ceiling. 5 wooden beams stretched from one side of the room to the other. 1, 2, 3. The third beam had a knot in the wood shaped almost like a small bird. I stared at it until everything else blurred. I counted the beams again, then again. The clock became louder. Tick, tick, tick. Time seemed broken. Minutes felt like hours. At some point, I realized tears were sliding across my cheeks. I hadn't even noticed myself crying. They slipped silently into my hair. Levi suddenly stopped. He looked at my face with genuine confusion. "You're crying." His voice was barely louder than a whisper. He reached up and gently brushed one tear away with his thumb. The gesture was so unexpectedly kind that it almost broke me. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Neither of us moved. The room became completely still. After what felt like forever, he asked one question. It was unfinished. "Do you want me to?" The rest never came, but the meaning was there. He was giving me an opening, a chance to speak honestly, a chance to say I was scared, a chance to stop everything. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. Inside my mind, two voices fought each other. One whispered, "Tell him." The other whispered louder, "Good wives endure." That second voice won. I forced myself to smile, a tiny smile. "It'll be all right," I said. The words tasted unfamiliar. Even as I spoke them, something deep inside me knew they weren't true. Years later, I would think about that single moment more than anything else, not because of what happened, because of what I never said. Around 4 in the morning, the kerosene lamp finally flickered. The flame danced once, twice, then disappeared. Darkness swallowed the room. Complete darkness. For the first time all night, nothing could be seen, only heard. Our breathing, the wind outside, the faithful ticking of the clock. And then, Levi spoke. Not as a husband, not as a man trying to fulfill expectations, just as the boy I had known since childhood. "I wrote you a letter once," he said softly into the darkness. I was 15. I turned toward his voice. "What letter?" "I never gave it to you." He laughed quietly. "I kept it hidden in my Bible." Silence. "I thought you were the prettiest girl I'd ever seen." Another pause. "I was too scared to tell you." For the first time that night, I answered with complete honesty. So was I. The darkness hid our faces, but somehow, it made the truth easier to speak. We reached for each other's hands. Neither of us said another word. Outside the window, somewhere beyond the cornfields, a rooster crowed. Morning had arrived, but neither of us knew what waited downstairs. The rooster crowed once, then again. Its sharp cry cut through the silence like a knife. Morning had arrived. For the first time all night, I felt something stronger than fear. Relief. The night was finally over. Gray light slowly crept through the small bedroom window, softening the darkness around us. Dust floated through the air like tiny pieces of ash. Somewhere outside, horses shifted in the barn. A cow let out a low call. The farm was waking exactly as it always had, but nothing inside me felt the same. Levi sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Neither of us knew what to say. The conversation we had shared in the darkness, the confession about the unsent letter, the honesty, the brief feeling that we were simply two frightened young people, had vanished with the sunrise. Reality had returned. "We should probably get dressed," he said softly. Not because he wanted to, because people would be waiting. Because newly married couples did not stay upstairs all morning. Because life, in our community, never paused long enough for feelings. I folded the wedding quilt carefully, smoothing every wrinkle as if neat corners could somehow organize the confusion inside me. The blue dress I had worn the day before now felt heavier. It no longer belonged to the hopeful girl who had climbed those stairs. Levi buttoned his black coat slowly. Neither of us looked at each other. We walked downstairs together. The kitchen was already full. The smell of pancakes, bacon, fresh bread, and strong coffee filled the house. Children laughed. Men discussed weather forecasts and crop prices. Women carried heavy serving bowls from the stove to the table. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. That was the strangest part. The world had continued exactly as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I suddenly understood that whatever a bride experienced during her wedding night belonged only to her. There would be no questions, no conversation, no space to process it. Only breakfast. I stepped into the room. Conversations paused for the briefest moment. Older women smiled knowingly. Several men nodded respectfully toward Levi. Then everyone returned to eating. No one asked how either of us had slept. No one asked whether we were frightened. No one asked if we needed time. My mother stood beside the stove flipping pancakes. When she noticed me, she wiped her hands on her apron and walked over quietly. She touched my elbow. "Come here." We stepped just far enough away that no one else could hear. She studied my face for several long seconds. Then she asked one question. "Was it all right?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "How do you feel?" Simply, "Was it all right?" I looked into her tired eyes. For the first time, I noticed how exhausted she looked. Not sleepy, worn, as if decades of carrying responsibilities no one ever discussed had settled permanently into her face. She had brought 11 children into the world. She had stood exactly where I stood once. Maybe she had been asked the same question. Maybe she had given the same answer. "Yes," I whispered. It was easier than explaining something I didn't yet understand. She nodded once. "Good." Then she returned to the stove. The conversation was over. I stood there holding an empty plate. Around me, everyone laughed, joked, and talked about harvest schedules. Inside me, everything felt strangely quiet. Over the next few weeks, married life settled into a rhythm. Morning chores, breakfast, laundry, cooking, gardening, evening prayers. Nothing about the routine seemed unusual. I became what everyone expected me to become: a wife, a daughter-in-law, a hard-working woman. People complimented how quickly I adapted. "She's adjusting beautifully. Such a capable young wife. Levi chose well." Every compliment felt like someone describing a different person, because something inside me had quietly disappeared. At first, I couldn't explain it. Whenever intimacy became part of married life, my mind drifted somewhere else. I counted things: the wooden ceiling beams, the stitches in the quilt, the tiny flowers embroidered into my pillowcase, the ticking of the old clock. Anything except the present moment. Sometimes I imagined walking through cornfields. Sometimes I mentally recited hymns from beginning to end. Sometimes I counted backwards from 100 over and over again. My body remained in the room. My thoughts went somewhere far away. I believed something was wrong with me. Good wives were supposed to enjoy closeness with their husbands. Good wives weren't supposed to disappear inside their own heads. Each time it happened, shame settled a little deeper inside me. I never spoke about it. Who could I tell? My mother? She had already answered every difficult question with silence. The bishop? He would remind me about duty. Other women? No one talked about these things, so I carried the secret alone. Levi noticed something had changed. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, he looked at me carefully. "You've been quiet lately." "I've always been quiet." He smiled gently. "No." He shook his head. "Not like this." I kept scrubbing the same plate long after it was already clean. "I'm just tired." He accepted the answer, or perhaps he wanted to believe it. Months passed. The distance inside me continued growing. The strange part was that I didn't stop loving Levi. In many ways, I loved him more. He brought me wildflowers when he remembered. He fixed loose boards around the house without being asked. Whenever I caught a cold, he quietly heated soup before dawn so I wouldn't have to cook. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to hurt me. That realization made everything even harder. If he wasn't the enemy, then why did I feel trapped? Years later, after I had left the Amish community, I finally sat inside a therapist's office for the first time. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old coffee. There was a green plant sitting beside the window. I remember staring at that plant while I tried to explain why I felt so disconnected from my own memories. The therapist listened patiently. When I finished speaking, she asked me a question no one had ever asked before. What did you do in your mind whenever you felt trapped? I counted. What did you count? Anything. She nodded slowly. Then she said a single word. Dissociation. I frowned. I don't understand. She smiled gently. Your mind found a way to protect you. I stared at her. No. I think it means I'm broken. She shook her head. No. She leaned forward. It means your brain loved you enough to survive. I couldn't speak. For years, I had carried shame over something I believed made me a bad wife. Now someone was telling me it had been my mind's way of keeping me safe. I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quiet tears rolling down my face while I looked at that impossible little plant growing beside the window. Hope returned in the smallest possible way. Not happiness, not healing. Just the possibility that maybe I had never been broken at all. But understanding the past created a new question I could no longer ignore. If Levi had never wanted to hurt me, if I still loved him, then why was staying becoming impossible? That question would eventually change both of our lives forever. People often ask me the same question. If things were so difficult, why didn't you hate Levi? I understand why they ask. Stories are easier when there is a villain. Life rarely is. The truth is far more uncomfortable. I loved him, and that love became one of the hardest things I ever carried, because every painful memory existed beside another memory that was gentle. When I caught influenza during the winter I turned 10, Levi was 12 years old. Our farms were 3 miles apart. The snow that year was so deep that wagon wheels disappeared beneath it. My mother later told me someone had knocked on the door just before sunset. When she opened it, Levi was standing there with snow covering his boots and shoulders. He was holding something behind his back. I heard she was sick, he said. Then he handed my mother a tiny wooden horse. He had carved it himself. Its legs weren't perfectly even. The mane was nothing more than rough knife marks. One ear was slightly larger than the other. But to me, it was the most beautiful gift I had ever received. He didn't stay for hot chocolate. He didn't come inside to warm himself. He simply smiled shyly and walked back into the snow. 3 miles, in freezing weather, just so a little girl wouldn't feel forgotten. That horse sat on my bedroom windowsill for years, through childhood, through Sunday singings, through my engagement, through my wedding. Sometimes I would dust it while wondering if Levi remembered making it. Years later, I realized something that broke my heart. The boy who walked through a snowstorm carrying a carved horse was the same man who shared my wedding night. Those two truths refused to separate. The other, and perhaps they never should. As our marriage continued, I began noticing something else. Levi carried invisible burdens of his own. Whenever older men discussed marriage, he became unusually quiet. Whenever the bishop preached about husbands leading their homes, his shoulders tightened. One evening I found him sitting alone in the barn long after chores were finished. He was turning his hat slowly in his hands, round and round, a habit he had since childhood. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded automatically. Then, after a long silence, "I'm trying." Those were the only words he offered. "I'm trying." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, I did. He wasn't trying to dominate me. He was trying to become the man everyone expected him to be. The community had taught him responsibility. It had taught him hard work. It had taught him obedience. But no one had taught him how to speak about fear. No one had taught him how to ask difficult questions. No one had taught him that love sometimes begins with listening instead of leading. He wasn't born knowing those things. Neither was I. We had inherited silence, just different versions of it. Months turned into years. Outwardly, we looked like a successful young Amish couple. The farm prospered, neighbors complimented our work, Family gatherings came and went. Photographs would have shown two people standing side by side. What they could never capture was how far apart we had become inside. The more I learned about myself, the more impossible it became to ignore the truth. Love was still there, but peace wasn't. One autumn evening, I finally admitted something I had spent months refusing to believe. If I stayed, I would slowly disappear. Not physically, spiritually, emotionally. I would become someone who smiled because smiling was expected, who obeyed because obedience was rewarded, who stopped recognizing her own reflection. Leaving the Amish community meant losing almost everything: my home, my routine, my family, my church, my identity. People imagine courage feels powerful. It doesn't. It feels like terror. The morning I decided to leave, I packed one small suitcase. That was all. A few dresses, a Bible, some letters, and the little wooden horse. I stood in our bedroom for a long time before walking downstairs. Levi was sitting at the kitchen table. His hat rested in his hands. He turned it slowly by the brim, round and round, exactly the way he always did whenever he was nervous. He looked up as I entered. Then his eyes fell to the suitcase. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked quietly, "So?" I nodded. Yes. His shoulders sank. He didn't argue. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't demand that I stay. He simply stared at the table. I hoped. He stopped, started again. I hoped we'd figure it out. So did I. Those 4 words nearly shattered me, because they were true. I had hoped too, more than anyone. He stood slowly. For one impossible second, I thought he might ask me to stay. Instead, he stepped forward and gently hugged me. Not tightly, not desperately, just gently, the way friends say goodbye at a train station. "I hope," he whispered. Then his voice disappeared. He couldn't finish the sentence. Neither of us could. I picked up my suitcase, walked to the front door, opened it. The morning air smelled of damp earth and cut hay. I stepped outside. When I reached the end of the lane, I looked back one last time. Levi was still standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, watching silently. That was the last time I ever saw him. People sometimes ask whether I regret leaving. No. People also ask whether I regret loving him. No. Both answers can exist together. Years have passed since then. Today, the little wooden horse still sits on my bookshelf. Time has darkened the wood. One leg remains slightly shorter than the others. It still wobbles whenever I pick it up. Sometimes I hold it in my hands for several minutes without saying a word. I think about the frightened boy who carved it. I think about the frightened young man who stood in that bedroom, believing he was doing everything right because no one had ever taught him another way. I think about the frightened 19-year-old girl who believed silence was holiness. And I think about the woman I eventually became. Healing didn't begin when I forgot the past. Healing began when I stopped forcing the past into simple categories. Some people are capable of loving you and hurting you. Sometimes those two truths exist at the same time. Holding both truths is difficult, but pretending one of them never existed is even harder. That is the lesson I carried with me when I left that community. Not anger, not revenge, just the quiet understanding that compassion does not erase pain, and pain does not erase love. The little wooden horse still wobbles when I dust it. Every time it does, I smile. Not because the memories no longer hurt, but because I finally learned that a heart can carry grief and gratitude at the same time. Perhaps that is what healing really looks like. Not forgetting. Simply learning how to hold both truths without letting either one destroy.